Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Rambling with Craft, a series I should probably make a logo for or rebrand with a name that has more than 2 seconds of thought put into it, considering I actually quite like making these fleshed out shower thought style videos. For today's video, we'll be looking at another series' art style, which I feel a bit conflicted about doing 2 of these in a row since this isn't meant to be an art style series. But I can't control what my brain thinks of, and the last one is currently my most viewed video, so why not capitalise on what did well? This time round though, we'll be doing things a little differently. In my rant for Bravely Default 2's art style changes, I was for the most part being pretty negative about the game, whereas the majority were pretty positive about it. However, today I'll be doing the opposite and having a mostly positive outlook while I make a case defending the art style of Super Smash Bros Brawl, a game that is pretty notoriously clowned on and made fun of within the community. As just a quick refresher, as most of the viewers will know, Brawl is a bit of an outlier from what you'd typically expect from a Nintendo game. It has this really gritty, dusty sort of photorealistic look to it. One of the most standout traits of the game was just how detailed Mario's overalls were, to the point where when telling a friend about this art style video, the only hint I gave them was denim and they were easily able to guess what I was talking about in one try. The reason why this game is so widely mocked is because after spending the whole GameCube generation moaning about the likes of the Wind Waker and begging for more realistic Zelda, Nintendo fans later learnt that this art style ages really badly the majority of the time. And this has only become more and more apparent over the years, as stuff like the Wind Waker HD was so widely praised for how good it looked, despite the fact that the remaster itself really just upped the resolution and put more blue in the ocean. Whilst Twilight Princess HD received a very sizable texture upgrade, but due to how badly the base game's visuals have aged over time, this remaster had a very, "Oh, it looks just like how I remember it looking," opposed to, "Wow, this looks amazing" reaction. Super Smash Bros Brawl's art style isn't identical to Twilight Princess's, but it definitely has a lot of similar aesthetics, and you can tell that by just looking at Link. The problem with this art style is that as technology improves, there's always a stark difference from what came before. I remember seeing Uncharted for the first time and thinking, wow, this looks just like a movie with real people, and now I look at it and it looks more like they're made of clay. On top of all of that, the Wii at the time was quite an underpowered console compared to its competitors, and that made the aging process all the more apparent. Here's the thing though. While I agree that most of the time, realistic art styles age really badly for the majority of games, especially older games, as we're getting negligible returns on new hardware. But when it comes to Super Smash Bros Brawl, I also believe that despite everything, Brawl has stayed relatively well preserved in hindsight, and there's actually a different Smash game that I believe has aged much worse, even if it hasn't had as much time to age. Before we can properly analyse Brawl's art style, I believe some context is needed, so let's go back to where it all started. Something to note is that with every generation of technology, the things that we remember and associate with them are its faults. The aesthetic of the 8 and 16-bit consoles is always so easy to recognise that you can look at a sprite or listen to a track from the era and easily pick it out. We remember their soundtracks so fondly that fan-made 8 and 16-bit renditions of songs from new video games always get a ton of attention. The thing is though, in the past, these bleeps and bloops were not an artistic choice, they were simply all the game developers and composers had to work with. And the only reason we can still appreciate it now is because of a mixture of exposure creating nostalgia for it, and due to some clever use of the medium. The saying that limitation breeds innovation does not only mean that the creator can produce something good despite whatever handicap that they're dealing with, but it also means that they can create something that is enhanced by that limitation. Movies back in the day were not in black and white by choice, it was a technical limitation, and yet one thing that was born from this was film noir, an entire genre/style of cinematography and now aesthetic that was born from having to make the most out of the limitation of only being able to use a monochromatic camera. However, despite advances in technology, film noir is something that's still used today in some shape or form. And not just in filmmaking, but in the likes of games as well, with more obvious examples like The Saboteur, or with film noir variants like neo-noir, with the likes of Judgment or the not so very subtly named LA Noire. So what has this got to do with Smash? Well, luckily for us, Smash has had an entry on every single home console Nintendo has produced since the N64, which means that we can look at each game and get a look at what Sakurai's team could achieve, as well as the limitations that they had to build each title around. Also, since Smash is a very iterative series, it's actually really easy to compare each title to one another. First up, we have our N64 entry, simply titled Super Smash Bros. Being on Nintendo's first console capable of 3D rendering, naturally, its models are incredibly primitive by today's standards. What's more, Smash being a fighting game, it needed to run at 60 FPS and couldn't get away with barely hitting 20 frames per second like Ocarina of Time, or 17 if you were in the UK, and so they were even more limited with the amount of things that they could do than usual. They did, however, do a few things to cut performance costs as much as possible, and they did so in such a way to help really enhance that lower poly look. Upon booting the game, you are greeted with a scene that looks like a kid's bedroom, when the soon-to-be famous Master Hand swoops across the room into a toy box, pulling out Mario and plonking him on the table, not unlike a ragdoll. After counting to 3, both the Mario and a placed Pikachu spring to life as the opening continues. This all gives the impression that the entirety of the game is simply a child playing with their toys as their imagination runs wild. This is actually a really good idea, as at the time a lot of developers were not used to animating 3D models, and in a lot of cases individual limbs and such were not actually connected to the body, so all they needed to do was rotate and bend them. It's something that's very clear when you look closely at Mario's arms in Super Mario 64, that notch halfway down is actually where the two blocks are just overlapping, and they just float so close together that it gives the illusion of being a solid object. Because of this method of modelling and animating, it means that the characters on screen do animate almost sort of like a doll or a puppet, and by establishing that idea from the moment you boot the game, it makes everything look and feel a lot more natural to the eye. The other thing that I believe is a core part of Smash 64's identity, albeit to a bit of a less extent, is that several elements of the game, such as a good majority of the items and all of the Pokemon summoned from Pokeballs, as well as some of the background elements, are all just 2D sprites. This definitely feels like it's less of an artistic choice and mainly just purely for optimization, but it's still something that I would describe as a unique part of Smash 64's identity, and I think that Sakurai agrees with me, since even with all the glow-ups that the stages received in Ultimate, those N64 stages have all stayed very faithful to their originals, JPEG Pokemon and all. We can now move on to Melee, where we get a radical shift in visuals, since we're now out of that experimental phase of 3D. Between the GameCube being a much stronger machine compared to those of the 5th generation of consoles, as well as the improved techniques and understanding of 3D game development, those limitations of the N64 were now completely gone. While Smash wasn't quite a launch game, it did release in that launch window, and because of this, HAL Laboratories had a lot to prove. Not just with Smash itself, but also with what the power of the GameCube could achieve. And so they set out to very deliberately make a big deal about what were originally the weaknesses of the first game. As a result, the model quality for each character was prioritized above all else and was improved exponentially, with Mario's character model having almost 15 times the amount of tries making it up, for example. It's very clear that the development team wanted to get as far away from the blocky angular look of the original and by extension many games of the previous gen, which gives us this very smooth, rounded, and almost polished look to all of the characters, which is very nicely tied into the trophies that Melee had newly introduced to the series. Just like the puppets in Smash 64, one of these trophies is the first thing you see upon booting the game, with Mario and several other fighters all coming to life to fight once more. Just like the previous game, this establishes that slightly different but otherwise continued aesthetic of all of these being toys or collectible figures coming to life. One other point that I want to mention is that with Melee we can see the attempt to move away from the look of the original and begin Smash's journey into a more realistic look in the texture department. While textures and such were not focused on as much as model quality, it is still a noticeable improvement. And if you look really closely, you can see the beginning of Mario's Brawl denim. However, due to the game's resolution and how far away the camera typically is, this is not something that you're likely to notice. Most of the characters as a whole all share this fairly dark but still colourful colour palette. It gives the game this slightly more edgy, mature look, at least compared to the toy box nature of the original. If I had to guess, since those people who played the original would be a bit older now, it was probably some sort of an attempt to sort of age the game along with the player. Now, finally moving on to Brawl, and the main reason this video exists. The reason why I gave all of that context is because I believe that it's important to know the position Sakurai, HAL Labs and Sora Limited were in at the time. So far we've had 2 Smash games, both of which are on 2 very different consoles, with each one playing towards the strengths of the platforms that they were on. But then comes along the Wii, which is essentially just an overclocked GameCube. Well, not quite, but it was only moderately more powerful and it still ran on the same infrastructure. It's important to note that each console generation normally has more than just a simple boost to terashits and gigafarts. There's changes to how the system works to make it more efficient. Despite being classed as a new gen console, the Wii is actually very akin to a would-be GameCube Pro. This meant that, unlike Melee, they couldn't use the huge jump in power to radically change up the visuals and aesthetic like they could before, so the team needed to come up with a new way to make the game look and feel new and different. Luckily, this wasn't by making the gameplay revolve around Waggle, because that would have been a travesty. Fortunately, since Melee was a launch game for the GameCube and Brawl came out halfway through the Wii's lifecycle, it meant that the team had a much better understanding of the system they were working on, and so they could apply more tricks of the trade to make the absolute most out of the Wii. While looking at the poly counts for the Brawl models, we can see that the difference compared to from that of 64 to Melee is comparatively not that different. Things have been rounded out a little bit more and tweaked to better suit their needs, but it's mostly the same. Which means that those textures are pretty much the only thing that gets us from this to this. And that's something that's really odd about Brawl. The texture quality is really high. Like, the resolution of so many of the textures, not just on the character models, but on the stages as well, are way higher than they really needed to be, especially considering the game's resolution would cap out at 480p, and just like Melee, the camera is usually zoomed out quite a bit. Now, all of the footage that I've shown for Smash 64, Melee, Brawl, and one other game have all been recorded within an emulator. This is to get as clear a view as possible. This is also to eliminate resolution as a factor, so we don't get bogged down as much talking about graphic fidelity and really focus on the art style. And also because my Wii got commandeered by my nephew. But my point is that even with a simple upres, there isn't really any textures that look particularly muddy. The crazy high resolution of the textures on one hand might feel like a waste since it's something that can't really be appreciated in the game's intended fashion, but there are some benefits to it still. Smash was already starting to feel like Nintendo's Hall of Fame back in Melee with its trophies, celebrating some of Nintendo's even more obscure titles such as the recently re-released and translated Famicom Detective Club. But it was with Brawl where Smash really cemented itself as such, with an absolute huge number of trophies and the game's diorama-like mode, but more importantly, every single stage and character model would be designed with some of the most lovingly crafted and most detailed representations of them. And the textures being as high-res as they are creates this effect where the models get more detailed the closer you get to them instead of looking worse. But all of this is technical level stuff on why the game looks good, and this is meant to be a video on the game's art style, so let's talk about that side of stuff now, as I believe both are important for establishing a game's look. For starters, Brawl really carved out its own unique visual identity for itself, especially compared to the other games in the series. Despite being on a platform with a very similar power level as Melee's, nobody's going to mistake one for the other. Like it or hate it, that gritty, dusty look really stands out in its own way, in a fashion that, after analysing and thinking about it, I wouldn't even call it photorealistic. Its aesthetic is not dissimilar to something like Fist of the North Star or Mad Max. It's certainly more realistic than most of the characters are used to looking like, but it's definitely still stylized in its own way. It's just more subtle than most people are used to. On top of this, the art style change also fits quite nicely into that pattern set up by 64 and Melee, in the sense that it's evolving and at least trying to suit the age group of the player. Granted, it's still a Nintendo game and one with Mario and Pikachu in it at that, and therefore it still had to appeal to kids, but the intent can be seen between the general change of aesthetic as well as inclusions like Solid Snake, not to mention some of the more dark and edgy moments of the Subspace Emissary, and the Subspace Emissary itself, come to think of it. Speaking of which, the levels in the Subspace Emissary have some really nice vistas as you play. There are a few areas that suffer from the same problem that the Bridge of Eldin has, where there's a lot of large, flat surfaces with just one constant texture stretched over it. But there are also a lot of areas that look really good, with some of the backgrounds having this almost paintedly pop-up book look to them, with the use of some clever texturing and parallax scrolling PNGs. Granted, some stuff like the trees, when they're really up close to the camera, do look pretty muddy, but this is because of the up-res and wouldn't be noticeable on the original hardware's resolution. And the amount of effort that went into the subspace levels is nothing compared to the game's actual stages, which I really don't feel like I even need to argue this. These stages are undoubtedly great looking. The likes of Halberd, Castle Siege, and Luigi's Mansion all look fantastic, and every stage that returned in Smash 4 Wii U was just straight up dragged and dropped in with no changes, since the team knew that while they could update the look of each stage, they didn't really need to. But more about that later. What I feel is truly the most important thing above all else though, is that Super Smash Bros Brawl has consistency. Smash as a concept is a bit of a nightmare because crossing over so many different series together with such varying art styles is bound to be difficult. Like, you plonk Snake, Mario, Marth, Ness, and Toon Link all next to each other, and tell someone that they're all supposed to be human, they'd call bullshit. And this is still the case with Brawl. However, the difference is when you have this consistent art style, you can at least unify these trans-dimensional fighters with some sort of theme. It gives the game its own sense of identity, and it makes the characters look as if, at least on some sort of level, they look like they belong together. This, however, is not something I can confidently say about Smash 4. Only Smash 4 Wii U, however. Smash for 3DS is perfectly fine. In fact, I know this video is meant to just be a defense of Brawl's art style, but we've moved past that at this point, I think. And I've talked about all the rest, so you know what, fuck it, let's talk about Smash 3DS. If you're hearing this, it means that I've somehow tricked you into listening to my rambles, which, honestly, I don't know how. I've been very upfront about this, but oh well. Side note, if you are still here, then thank you, it means the world to me. If you're not already subscribed, then by all means please give my channel a look. I've got various other videos on here, mostly JRPGs, but I'm getting off topic, I'll carry on. Now, Smash 3DS is a fun one. I don't necessarily feel like it's aged well at all, though that's more due to the technical side of things, and not because of the game's art style, which I actually think is my personal favourite in the series. Smash 4 3DS's problem is that it barely runs on the 3DS. It's honestly amazing what Sakurai and the new team from Namco were able to achieve, but it wasn't easy. There's a lot of optimizations that get the game working. Like, for instance, while the game runs at 60 FPS, the Pokemon, the assist trophies, and several other elements are limited to only 30 FPS to make it run better. And another little interesting tidbit is that Sakurai got special permission to make the game reboot the 3DS's operating system to a much simpler version of itself, so he could have as much power going into the game as possible. Which is why, unless you had a new 3DS, stuff like the 3DS's internet browser and Miiverse were disabled when playing Smash 4 3DS. The game is literally pushing past what the system is actually capable of, or supposed to be at least. This, however, does not change the fact that the 3DS has honestly a kind of pathetic 240p screen, and while it isn't a huge deal for most of the 75 million people who bought it, it certainly doesn't bode well for upscaling the game to 1080p though. Clearing away all those pixels usually leaves you with a really blurry mess of a skybox most of the time. Final Destination does look pretty good though. Despite playing it in this unintended state, however, I still can't help but find myself charmed by this entry in the series. Like, I mentioned before that each Smash game's art style has been formed via the limitations that it had to put up with in development, and it's very clear that Smash for 3DS was shackled down pretty badly. However, with more limitations comes more innovation, and since the 3DS had a small, handheld 240p screen, the biggest concern to the devs had to be the visibility, so they opted to give the game a sort of comic book style look to it. With this, Smash 4 3DS rocked a really saturated colour palette, as well as these thick, bold black outlines around characters, giving the illusion of some sort of line art or maybe even an ink brush. There's also a few subtle additions to the game's art style, like how much of the shading is simply textured onto the character models, giving them this really dark pencil shaded aesthetic to them. And there's these really chunky hit sparks that look like the sort of splat effects that you'd find in a comic. And I just feel like this all ties together really nicely. Every time I see the game, I'm reminded of just how good I think everything looks, especially considering it's doing so much for a console that's a good deal weaker than the GameCube. It always feels like I'm cheering for the little underdog that went out there and tried their best to perform above and beyond, and that's exactly what they did. Smash 4 Wii U, on the other hand, I feel like has the opposite strengths and weaknesses its handheld twin did. As I mentioned, Smash for 3DS has really suffered, but only really due to the technical problems, and has managed to hold up via its excellent art design. While Smash for Wii U was not really tied down by any technical limitations at all, to the point where, for the first time, 8-player Smash was even an option. Despite this though, Smash for Wii U's art style is... well, to be honest, it's bordering on non-existent. But before you start grabbing your pitchforks, just hear me out. I've got some good points, honestly. Besides, as I said, it's really good on a technical level. It's still very competently put together. It's not like PlayStation All-Stars or something. I just feel like Smash 4 could have really done with a bit more time in the oven, or rather a bit more attention, as I'll explain. For starters, let's just remember that both Smash for 3DS and Wii U were developed at the same time, and Sakurai and his team wanted to have as much parity between the two versions as they could get away with. With that in mind, let's also take into account the fact that the 3DS outsold the Wii U by a wide margin, meaning that its player base was much larger. The amount of love and passion that usually goes into a Smash Bros game was already being split in two. But it's also fairly easy to assume that most of the team's efforts were focusing on helping the struggling handheld run the game as best as possible, while leaving the Wii U version as a bit of an afterthought, because if the 3DS could handle it, the Wii U would be able to. That's not to say the version of Smash 4 on Wii U was made lazily though. Stuff like trophies were back and bigger than ever, and with this being the first quote-unquote HD Smash game being above 480p, all of the characters received really nice HD models, with my particular favourite being Samus, as it's a decent blend of her Prime and other M looks. And all of this new stuff looked really great. But that's where the problems start to crop up, because there's actually a surprising amount in Smash 4 that isn't new. I mentioned before that the stages in Brawl were so high quality that the team could get away with essentially dragging and dropping the stages into Smash 4. They were definitely touched up a little bit here and there, but the differences are fairly minimal. By itself, this is not really a problem. I mean, Brawl did the same thing with several melee stages, and it gives the game more stages in general, so that it's just only a good thing. However, nearly half of the game's stages are ported in from previous Smash titles, which, again, isn't a problem by itself. But when so many are like this, and they've all been built for different art styles, this is where you start to lose that consistent look. And this is generally where my problem with the look of Smash for Wii U is. Nothing in it is inherently bad per se, but the problem is that the game kind of just feels like a mismatch of a bunch of assets that don't really feel like they were at all intended to be together. The look of every previous game in the series has this feeling that it's more of the sum of its part, while Smash for Wii U just feels like the sum. 64 had this 2D, 3D puppet look, Brawl had its gritty, sandy, dusty look, and Smash for 3DS had that comic book style. While Smash on the Wii U doesn't really have any unified aesthetic. Like, if we look at the Zelda cast, whose Twilight Princess iterations were basically already in something very similar to the Brawl's art style, you can then compare the new looks to the old and say what the Smash 4 art style is, but I don't really know what I'd call this. Like, if I was being nice, I'd say it looks clean, but I could also say that it looks sterile and mean the same thing. It would just give a different impression. I don't want to tear into it too much more though. As I mentioned before, I feel like it's a natural result of splitting the development between itself and the 3DS game. I think it's very clear that Smash for Wii U just never really got the time it needed, and since Sakurai wanted to share an identity with the 3DS game, it meant that it couldn't really push the boundaries of the Wii U either. Luckily, this is where Smash Ultimate comes in. There was a lot of talk about Ultimate when it was first announced of whether it was going to be a port or a brand new game, and I feel kind of confident saying it's kind of both. Ultimate is not a port of Smash 4 in any real sense of the word, but it's also really clear that it used Smash 4 as a kind of base, and to me it feels like what the game would have been had it not had to make way for its handheld brother. Granted, the Switch is a bit stronger than the Wii U, so there's definitely some improvements over this scenario that I'm painting in my head, but my point still stands. The jump from Smash 4 to Ultimate is not unlike the one from Melee to Brawl, with the latter games ultimately being refinements of what came before. Ultimate has a bunch of technical improvements over its predecessor. Firstly, the lighting was completely overhauled for a much more bright and vibrant look, and a lot more things actually cast light from them, which gives us things like the orange glow from Mario's fireballs actually lighting him and the stage beneath him as well. Also, the colour palette is a lot deeper and just as a whole looks a lot less flat. There's also this much softer look to the lighting with a more dramatic range of colours but with more gradual changes between them. The picture usually has this slightly more bright and warm temperature to it, which I feel really helps the anime swordsman crew look a hell of a lot less pale. On top of all of this, every single stage got a significant overhaul, with much higher poly counts and reworked textures that really reinvent them to look gorgeous. Fountain of Dreams, Temple, and Congo Falls in particular simply blow me away compared to how they originally looked. This is but one of the steps that helps unify the game's look as one complete style, with the only exceptions being the N64 stages however. They did receive modern touch-ups, but still retained that original aesthetic to pay homage to where it all started. Also, I have no idea where you'd even begin trying to remake Peach's Castle stage from the N64. From a design standpoint, it really doesn't make any sense. The other things that Ultimate added to the look of Smash for Wii U are some more subtle things, but it's stuff that still really caught my eye when we got that first look of gameplay in this trailer. A lot of the game's alpha effects, stuff like lightning, energy blasts, and fire, etc., all have this really opaque look to them. There's barely any transparency to them at all anymore, which is just a lot more visually striking and interesting as it allows for big, bright, strong colours that really stand out to the eye. This also applies to what is probably my favourite visual choice of Smash Ultimate, being the coloured smoke that is left behind when somebody is sent flying from a Smash attack. This doesn't really show very well with the footage I've got, since I only fought against CPUs and the smoke that they leave behind is all white, but I'll find some 8-player Smash footage to put up. But yeah, something that really stood out to me when we first saw Smash Ultimate gameplay was the fact that every time somebody was sent flying off screen, they'd always have coloured smoke trailing behind them, the colour being based off the person who landed the hit that sent them flying. This means that if you have a match of 4 or more human players, you get this sort of display that's not unlike an air show or something. It's such a visually striking choice that is unique to Ultimate, but also serves a mechanical purpose in allowing players to see who's hitting who in the heat of the action. And to top it all off, you have that slow crimson screen shake on any finishing blow that just really gives the end of each match a visual impact. Outside of that, most of what Smash Ultimate has is the same or very similar to Smash for Wii U. It's all just a matter of refining. I do still feel like Smash Ultimate's aesthetic kinda lacks the ability to describe its look in one word or phrase, but it's still a big improvement. Although, with the roster getting as big as it is, I think trying to fit everything under one single complete style is really not that feasible these days. The team seem content with beautifully recreating the look and feel of each new character they add via DLC, whilst injecting them with that little bit of Smash Ultimate flair just to tie it all together. With Terry probably being the best example of them getting that balance just right, but considering the huge KOF and Fatal Fury fan Sakurai is, that doesn't really surprise me in the slightest. And that's a not so brief look at every single one of the Smash games. Even though it was meant to be a quick 10 to 15 minute video of me defending Brawl at first, it seems that while writing the script, I let my passions get the better of me and probably dragged this out way too long than it needed to be. But hey, not everything's going to go to plan. What's important is that you adapt to your situation. This script was actually written before my Final Fantasy VII video, and I had a bit here talking about how it's probably my longest script yet, but that's not the case anymore. Either way, I'm apologising to Future Craft for giving him more stuff to edit. Looking back on all of this in hindsight, it definitely feels like I might have leaned onto the rambling side of things a bit too much, especially considering this was intended to be a well thought out video essay. Even after cutting down the script here and there, there's probably a few points that I reiterated a bit too many times. But at the same time, I really wanted to hammer those points home, so thank you for putting up with me. If there's anything that you thought I could have done better or anything that you liked, then please tell me in the comments below. Like, I really like feedback, and don't be shy, just tear into me. It makes me stronger and my opinion's worse. Next video I'm going to be putting out is probably going to be the next episode of the Play a Real Shin Megami Tensei series. I'll be doing Nocturne HD since it's the new release. So if you want to see that, then stick around by subscribing. Or don't, either way, it's fine. Anyway, once again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.